Carbon Bill on Environmental and Public Health. During this live event, we will examine the broad implications of the bill, how this fits into a wider European and global perspective, and the opportunities for health gain provided in the bill and action beyond. This event is being recorded right now, and the recording will be available in our website and YouTube channel, Irish Global Health Network. Live streaming is also available right now on our YouTube channel, Irish Global Health Network. If you have any questions during the webinar, please send them via the questions and answer features at the bottom of the screen or via the chat box. For now, I will leave you with my co-host for today, Niall Roche, Environmental Health Specialist. Welcome, Niall.
Thank you very much, Hala, and thanks for that introduction. And welcome everyone to this event. As Hala said, my name is Niall Roche, and I'm an environmental health specialist. And I currently work within the Irish health system as an environmental health officer with the Health Service Executive. But I also have a number of kind of lecturing or teaching roles in the area of public health and climate change. And this initiated my interest in this particular topic. And those of you who know environmental health, you might know that our motto is that prevention is better than cure. And in 2009, I read in The Lancet that climate change is the greatest threat to global health in this century, and that climate change is an environmental health hazard of unprecedented scale. So I felt we needed to have a say in this issue from an environmental health profession perspective. So in those intervening years, I've been teaching on this subject for about 10 years now. I have been increasingly exasperated by the almost complete lack of reference to health whenever climate change is discussed. Whenever UHC is mentioned, it seems to me it is often described as universal health care and not universal health coverage, thereby missing, I think, the emphasis on prevention and promotion within the realm of universal health coverage. However, let's keep positive. I am heartened to hear, for example, that the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, has a plan to be carbon neutral by the mid or early 2040s. And here in Ireland, climate action is central to Irish government policy at the moment. But I suppose the question is health central within that policy? And that's what we will explore today. The new Low Carbon Development and Climate Action Amendment Bill 2021 is currently going through the Irish Parliament. So this discussion, I think, is timely. It is also timely for other reasons. We have a hugely important decade up to 2030 to address climate change in a meaningful way. We also have the Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved by 2030. We have COP26 due in Glasgow later at the end of the year. And we also have an opportunity to see recovery from COVID-19 deliver health co-benefits while simultaneously addressing climate change. So in this live event, we hear from a range of different speakers leading on different aspects of work in this particular area. And I'm delighted to introduce each of our four speakers now in an abridged version, and I think you'll get wider bios on each of the speakers through the chat box. Our first speaker will be Dr. Deirdre Roche, and he's an associate professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. His research focuses on climate change politics and governance, and he teaches on DCU's MSc in climate change policy, media and society. He's also co-author of a recent book on Ireland and the climate crisis, which I think will be in the chat box when he is speaking. Our second speaker is Anne Stauffer. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Anne is the Health and Environment Alliance's Deputy Director and Strategic Lead. She leads HEAL's activities on climate change, energy and air quality, and provides strategic input for HEAL's organizational development, advocacy and engagement of stakeholders across the entire European region. You're very welcome, Anne, from Heidelberg in Germany. And Tim Collins will be our third speaker. He's currently the CEO of the Irish Heart Foundation. He's a former GP. He's a former chief executive of News Talk radio station from 2015 to 2017. He's also a qualified barrister, as it happens. And between 1990 and 1997, he acted as special advisor to government ministers Mary Harney and Brendan Howlin at the Departments of Health and the Department of the Environment. And our fourth speaker, last but not least, is Dr. Ina Kelly, who studied medicine in NUI Galway, the National University of Ireland in Galway. And she is chair of the HSE Public Health Medicine, Environment and Health Group. And prior to COVID-19, her main areas of work included climate change adaptation. She represents health on the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Advisory Council. And she is committed to strengthening the public health medicine and is president of the Irish Medical Organisation. So you're all very welcome. And I'm going to start with you, Dermot, if you'd like to unmute yourself, or someone can unmute Dermot, and begin by asking you, Dermot, about the Climate Action Amendment Bill due to be enacted in the coming weeks. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the bill and how it has come to pass?
Sure, and before I answer that question, Niall, thanks very much for the invitation to join you. Full disclosure, I'm not a public health, environmental health expert, and in that regard, I really look forward to hearing the interventions of the other panelists and learning from them. So the history of the bill that's now going through Parliament, as Niall said, can be traced back to Ireland's Citizens' Assembly that ran from 2016 to 2018 and deliberated on the topic of climate change among five topics, and voted 97% in favour of the recommendation that to ensure climate change is at the centre of policymaking in Ireland, as a matter of urgency, a new or existing independent body should be resourced appropriately, operate in an open and transparent manner, and be given a broad range of new functions and powers in legislation to urgently address climate change. So that's the kernel of how we got to where we are today, which is the Climate Action Amendment Bill on the verge of being enacted. That kernel of a recommendation was fleshed out by an Oireachtas all-party committee on climate action in 2018 and into early 2019, which fleshed that out into a recommendation that the existing 2015 Climate Action Bill should be amended. I should say also that the 2015 climate law was itself 8 years in the making. Friends of the Earth started a campaign back in 2007 for a climate change bill. And when that was enacted in 2015, there was, I think, a widespread recognition that it was a start, but it wasn't strong enough and that it would need in time to be amended. And so that's how we got to where we are today.
Thank you, Dermot. And how does the current bill strengthen the existing Climate Act of 2015?
It strengthens it in a variety of ways. In the short time I have available, I might highlight three particular aspects. The first is the long-term target. So the 2015 Act had a very vague, what was called a national transition objective, and without any quantification of what was to be achieved. It was just a pretty loose, fluffy target for 2050. The new bill doesn't have numbers in it, but the wording is to pursue and achieve a climate resilient, biodiversity rich, environmentally sustainable and climate neutral economy. And it's the climate neutral part from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective is the really important part. And that basically gets at the point that we need to reduce emissions as close to zero as possible, greenhouse gas emissions, and balance any remaining emissions but through carbon sinks. And the time frame for that is 2050 at the latest. The second element, and this has got a lot of coverage in the media as the bill has passed through the Houses of Parliament, is that it sets a framework for setting what are known as carbon budgets, binding commitments, overall ceilings for a 5-year period. There will be 3 of these set as a package later this year, 21 to 25, 26 to 30, and 31 to 35. The first 2 of those, it's written into the bill, are to provide for a 51% reduction in national emissions by 2030. And to put that in context, only one other country in the world has a more ambitious decarbonisation target for this decade, and that's Denmark. So it's extremely ambitious. And the third element is that it will provide a stronger accountability framework. So ministers will be accountable to the Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. So they'll be asked to account for progress or lack thereof.
Okay, thank you very much for clearing those three areas for us, Dermot. Do you see any limitations to the bill that's currently passing through the Oireachtas?
There are, so it's not perfect, and I don't think we could ever expect a piece of legislation to be perfect. So, you know, one limitation, Niall, I know you've pointed to, and I'm sure it'll come up in our discussion, is, you know, the area of health isn't mentioned there. In response to that, I might say that this is a framework piece of legislation. It doesn't go into the details of different sectors or different areas of society. So it really just sets the broad framework. The language around climate justice, just transition and public participation, civil society have been quite critical about that, and various amendments were proposed at committee stage as the legislation was passing through the Dáil, but the government chose not to accept those amendments. The other thing I would note is that the bill can't do all the heavy lifting itself. And I think there's a risk that we think that just because this piece of legislation has binding greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, that therefore they will be achieved. I mean, there's nothing sacrosanct about legally binding commitments. And if a government really doesn't want to comply with legal obligations, it won't do so. But what legally binding commitments, like the carbon budgets, do is that they raise the political cost of non-compliance. They make it harder for government to ignore the targets. But to reiterate, the climate bill is just the framework for climate action, and we need, as a matter of urgency, then to see all of the policies and measures that the government plan to implement in order to achieve the targets set out in the bill.
Okay, thank you, Dermot. Yeah, so we really need decent action on top of the framework is what I'm hearing from you. Now, do you know what the consequences are, including the financial consequences for Ireland for not or failing to meet our targets, either for 2020 or beyond?
Yeah, so it's easiest to answer, though not entirely easy to answer, the question about 2020 targets, because we had targets under EU legislation for both greenhouse gas emissions reductions and for renewable energy deployment. And the most recent material I can find from this is from government, from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And the document I have to hand is from March 2020. So that's just on the eve of the COVID-19 pandemic. And they were estimating at that point that the cost, so there are two parts of this. There's greenhouse gas emissions reductions and then renewable energy. So the cost of greenhouse gas emissions reduction was, they estimated, 2 to 14 million euro. But it's important to note that that's basically a trading mechanism at EU level. So countries that under-comply have to buy compliance from countries that over-comply. And this includes the year 2020. So already in March 2020, the Department of Public Expenditure were saying that the EU overall was going to over-comply. So the cost of those credits were going to be quite low, and COVID will have exacerbated that. The costs of the renewable energy targets are higher, deeper estimate, 60 to 120 million. But beyond that, the cost for 2030 is a bit harder to say at this stage.
Okay, Dermot, thank you very much indeed. I think we're out of time basically there. Just to say to everyone that we will have the four speakers and then we'll have the opportunity, as Hala said, to ask questions. And if you can post them through the Q&A box or the chat box, we'll try and address those after the four speakers. So for now, Deirdre, thank you very much, and I'll turn my attention to Anne. So Anne, I hope we can get you up on the screen.
Yes.
There you are. How are you?
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and make the link from the, from your discussions in Ireland to the EU level and back. So pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to let everyone know, the Irish Global Health Network are now a member of HEAL since I think late last year. So can I just ask you, Anne, what are the latest climate developments in Brussels, and how will climate action and decarbonisation impact health?
Thank you, Neil. And climate discussions and developments are very much an issue in Brussels as well, and for the EU. And that is because policymakers are moving along in the implementation of the EU Green Deal. This is a framework that was presented in December 2019, so just before the pandemic. And we're actually quite pleased to see that it continues to be a relevant policy framework as we're moving through the pandemic and out of it. And the EU Green Deal is really important for climate because of two things. Number one, it sets the goal of achieving a climate neutrality for the EU by 2050. So it has a clear long-term goal, but it also sets a 2030 target. So the target for the next decade, as you mentioned, Neil, is really key, and is the next years will be decisive to see if we can actually get to the transformation and tackling climate change that we need to see happening. And for that, the policymakers have recently agreed on upping the EU's target from -40% to -55%. And this is a welcome step, but unfortunately, and here's my big but, this is not enough in terms of the reduction that we need to see from the urgency to act, from what we know from the science, from what we also know will be the huge health benefits that we're going to see from decarbonization action. And unfortunately, this is something that hasn't yet fully hit home with the policymakers yet.
Okay, thank you, Anne. And in relation to COVID-19, you mentioned there COVID-19. How can we use COVID-19 recovery action to deliver health co-benefits that you see from EU level?
Certainly, and I think regarding the recovery action, building back better, I think we're really at such an important moment and an unprecedented moment, because we're seeing vast amounts of money being made available to lead us out of the pandemic and to kickstart back the economy. At EU level, it's almost 700 billion euros that will be dispersed through a recovery and resilience funds for the EU member states, and they can apply for that, and that's currently in the process of being awarded. But in this money, we really have to make sure that we achieve that shift from polluting industry and economy and ways of life that we currently have to a green one and a healthy one. And to give you an example there for energy, I think there is very much agreement that public money, EU taxpayers' money, shouldn't be used to financing further coal power generation because of the huge climate and health impacts. But there is no agreement yet that EU money shouldn't be used to stop all fossils, and specifically gas here. So it's still technically possible for member states, for national governments, to use EU recovery money to finance gas infrastructure or finance the conversion of a former coal plant into a gas plant, and these kinds of activities. And we just think from a health perspective, this is the wrong approach, because we would again lock in polluting activities instead of fully turning and really giving a much needed boost to renewables and to a healthy energy future.
Okay, thank you. And 700 billion euro sounds like an awful lot of money. I didn't clear this question with you in advance, so maybe apologies for this one, but do you know if there's any obligation to use that money wisely in terms of trying to deliver health benefits? Are there any conditions?
So what they have to do, yes, I should have added as well that in theory, 30 whatever member states propose for financing, 37% of this money should actually go to climate activities. But of course, the devil is in the detail, and this is also where our health engagement and expertise is needed to then, review the plans and see if this is actually going to climate, and then plus it should really go to these activities that offer the highest boost, or the highest wins for health, for the climate, and also for clean air, because we know that there are certain measures, if we look at transport, for example, walking and cycling, where we'll see the greatest benefits, but this is so far not very much considered. And we have a list of activities, we know what the right measures are, but it's making sure that the financing actually gives support to the measures that need to happen.
Okay, brilliant, Anne. Yeah, because I know finance is a key building block for any health system. So brilliant. The last question I want to ask you is in relation to the Conference of the Parties, or COP. 26, which is coming up in Glasgow. Can you spell out the importance of this year's COP for health? And have we seen a greater emphasis on health in the climate change negotiations in recent years from your experience going, I know since 2009, you were at your first COP.
Thank you. And indeed, this year's COP will be decisive because it'll be the COP to take stock 5 years after the landmark Paris Agreement of 2015. And I think what's often forgotten, and what we as health people have to remind policymakers, is that the Paris Agreement is ultimately a public health treaty. And it's really important that actually governments stick to the commitments made in the Paris Agreement, because right now we're unfortunately on track of losing, of missing the Paris target, and it needs further commitments. It needs further decarbonization, and that's what we're hoping to see as a strong message out of Glasgow later. And this is also where we as the health community have a unique role to play in participating in conversations prior to COP, in being present, be it virtual or in person. We still have to see. For example, there'll be a 2-day climate and health conference. There'll be a special report by the World Health Organization for COP26, and they're consulting with various stakeholders. So there are many opportunities for each one of us, for organizations, to get involved. And certainly this kind of increased involvement is what I've seen, and what we as an organization and network have also been really pleased. You mentioned 2009 was the first COP that I attended. And back then we were only a handful of health people, including WHO and non-governmental health actors. And really in the past decade, you have seen this increased awareness of, from all walks of life of the health community, and stronger presence at COP, including in Paris, for example, where we had hundreds of people gathering for a climate and health conference.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So cause for optimism, I suppose, seeing that more and more people are involved in the health side of the climate negotiations. And interesting for you to hear you say also that the Paris Agreement is a public health agreement. So I really like hear you saying that. I think we're out of time for you at the moment, Anne, but we'll get back to you later on for a final comment at the end. If I can turn my attention now to Tim Collins. Can we see you there, Tim? How are you, Tim?
I'm good, Niall. Thank you very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. I think the first question links to what we were asking Deirdre earlier on in terms of some of the limitations about the new Low Carbon Development and Climate Action Amendment Bill 2021. How do you see the linkages between health and climate being addressed in this bill?
Well, as Deirdre has indicated, not very well, unfortunately. It's there, but in a very weak way. So Section 2, or Part 2, Section 8 talks about when the minister is preparing a climate action plan and a long-term strategy, he should have regard to a lot of factors, about 18 or 20 factors, and protection of public health is one of those factors. I think that the strengthening of the definition around climate justice is helpful. It talks about safeguarding the rights of vulnerable persons and endeavouring to share the burdens and benefits arising from climate action. And we think that could be, broadened out in the context of interpreting it to include health issues and health inequality. Probably the most disappointing aspect of the bill is the absence of a specific commitment to include a public health expert in the new Climate Advisory Council, or the newly constituted council. And that's a key body, obviously, that will be responsible for planning and monitoring the implementation of the bill or the new act. The council composition is very broad and sets out a lot of different areas of expertise that should be included, and health stands out in its absence. But I'd agree with Dermot in that this is a framework bill. It's very light. It really most of the hard work that's going to be done will be in the plans and the strategy. So there is ample opportunity for the minister to mend his hand, if you like, and actually, include health, in the context of planning and putting together the long-term strategy.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I suppose the next two questions, they're kind of linked together. So how would you like to see a greater emphasis on health in the bill to make it a better piece of legislation and more effective? And then I suppose on top of that, in terms of that, is the action, I suppose, what would you like to see happen? going forward as rolling two questions into one.
Well, I guess the first point I'd like to make about the bill is that, you know, the bill has to be taken in the context of where we are, and where we are is in an extraordinary time in terms of, you know, public policy over the last 20 years. We're coming out, hopefully, the far side of a global epidemic, and, you know, everybody's talking about building back better. And in the context of that, we've put together a bill which isn't doing that. So I just quote you very briefly from the Lancet policy brief to the EU in December 20, and they're making one big recommendation, which is that in the aftermath of COVID-19, that governments implement triple win policies and investments which preserve the climate, protect public health, and promote economic sustainability. And they say climate, health, and economic objectives are not only mutually reinforcing, but mutually dependent. It's a big missed opportunity for the bill not to have, in the context of COVID, made that linkage between public health, environmental protection, and the actions we need now to take to solve the problem. Moving on from that, then, I think there's a big missed opportunity in not putting health into the bill, and for one reason, and that is that there's increasing opposition in certain parts of society, resistance to the types of actions that the bill is going to actually have to promote, and they're, you know, around things like the carbon tax, ending turf cutting, reducing the size of the national herd, you know, even resistance to bicycle lanes, which everybody thought, you know, everyone would love, but mounting resistance to those. And a key driver of that resistance is the inability of the public and politicians and everybody, in fact, to see beyond the horizon, to look at long-term threats. And climate change has always been, you know, part of that tragedy of the horizon that Mark Carney talked about. And we believe that the key to actually unlocking that resistance and reducing it actually is to make the short-term benefits of action on climate more easily apparent, and health is one of those. And I give you an example: air pollution. We've always framed air pollution as an environmental issue, but when you frame action on air pollution as a health issue, you can actually get people to move away from long-term thinking into short-term thinking of the benefits. And so we presented to the Oireachtas committee last week, and, you know, we were taken by surprise at the lack of awareness by the Oireachtas Health Committee of the impact of air pollution on health. So about 1,300 people a year die every year in Ireland from inhaling particulates from the burning of fossil fuels. And yet there was a low level of awareness there. The bill was an opportunity for us to actually integrate our thinking on environment and health in a way that actually would allow us to unlock public resistance, to reduce that public resistance, and to start framing the actions that we need to take in terms of that short-term health benefit rather than the long-term climate benefit, which we all understand, but understandably a large portion of the public say, well, look, that's not our problem now, we have more immediate problems. So let's make the problems much more immediate. So we think health is a lever for change, which, being absent in the bill, is a big missed opportunity. And, you know, I'll give you one other example. Agriculture, huge resistance to the reduction in the size of the national herd. And we're talking about, obviously, understandably, reducing methane. But I think if we began to frame that in terms of the public health benefit of reducing the amount of meat we eat and the amount of dairy we consume, and increasing or changing our diets to a more plant-based diet, then people might start to understand there are benefits actually to changing our agricultural system that are immediate positive benefits for them and their family. And then the final bit of your question, you asked me about what can we do to change? Well, we think, first of all, the minister should co-opt a public health person, such as Ina, or, you know, somebody who actually has that broad view and understands the subject matter, onto the Climate Change Advisory Council. And the bill doesn't preclude him from doing that. He can do that. We think that the plans and the strategies then should explicitly, you know, cite health as being a major co-benefit of action. And then we think they should start to prioritise early on the areas of action that will benefit health, like, you know, reducing air pollution, adopting WHO guidelines in terms of air quality standards, and so on and so forth.
No, amazing, brilliant, Tim. Thank you very much. You reminded me there of Article 4F, I think it is, of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992, which mentioned the interconnection between the environment, public health, and the economy. So it does go back to 1992, from what I recall, anyway. I think we're almost out of time there, Tim. But there's one other thing I wanted to ask you about, because we in the Irish Global Health Network, we recently joined you in relation to the Climate and Health Alliance. Can you briefly explain what the Climate and Health Alliance is and what it does?
Well, very briefly, we came together with a number of organizations about 18 months ago to set up the Climate and Health Alliance. And the idea was that we felt there was a gap in the public discourse on climate, and that was around making the connections between not only the damage that climate change is going to do to public health in terms of infectious diseases and heat and so on, but more importantly for us as a Heart Foundation, an absence of any discussion on the co-benefits, on the clear benefits to public health from early action on climate change in terms of, active travel, reducing air pollution and so on. So we came together with a range of different organizations, the Irish College of General Practitioners, Irish Doctors for the Environment, we're part of the Global Health Network, and the various different colleges and so on, to try and create a platform to actually further discussion on that. And we've done that, over the last year. In spite of COVID, we've been active participants in a lot of public consultations and discussions on everything from cycle lanes through to air quality standards and so on. And we've a number of working groups now looking at sustainable diet, on green spaces and so on. And we hope coming out of COVID to be more influential as we move on. And we hope to be one of the organizations that's actually helping to drive the actions that will come out of this bill, because the bill is only the beginning. It really is just a framework. Unless it actually results in serious plans and serious action, we're really not going to hit those targets.
Brilliant, Tim. Thank you. I hear you loud and clear. You make your points very forcibly. This is only the beginning, and that the bill is only a framework, and we need to see action. Thank you very much for now, Tim. We'll get back to you later on for a final parting word. And I'll turn our attention to Ina Kelly. If we
Thanks,
can see
Niall.
Ina on the screen. How are you, Ina? And how are you
Grant,
doing?
thank you very much, Niall, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this as well. It's great to be involved in such a lovely webinar, and also to hear all the other contributors as well, which is great. I'm educating myself very well, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Ina. We've heard a lot, I suppose, already, in particular maybe from Tim in relation to health. Have you anything to add to Tim's comments on the health implications of the low carbon and climate action bill?
Yeah, I agree with him, and I'm very concerned. Yeah, I mean, obviously we completely and utterly welcome all the good things that are there, which is great. But the problem, of course, is that every time you set a point in time and you miss opportunities, those opportunities, there's a cost to that as well then. And so it is good if this is just a framework and it's going to be allowed to expand into being more comprehensive, in more comprehensive protection of health and so on. And I suppose, yeah, when I was a bit surprised in looking at it, is that it mentions the protection of public health, but it doesn't seem to have any mechanism for ensuring that actually occurs. One of the ways is having somebody on the advisory council, though I'm not sure that would be sufficient. It would be just a recognition of the fact that health is an important stakeholder in this. And I think that was one of the big reasons why we're interested in climate action in the first place, is the health and well-being of the world's population, and in our own country, in our own population as well. So yeah, I think that's one of the things. And of course, another thing that I think is important is health in all policies. That policy is often developed in silos in Ireland and without being integrated with the other potential impacts across the system. And I think that's the same for biodiversity and health, are both areas that probably are receptors of other people's policies. So if you're talking about risks and things like a risk pathway, we often do that in the environment, and we look at a source of an issue, a pathway, and then the receptor. And humans and I think our ecology and biodiversity are impacted by other people's policies. And if they're making policy without any consideration for their impact in another sector, that's a problem. And so the World Health Organization has recommended that we do have health in all policies. And I think that's important that we start bringing that in anywhere, that we start to develop these tools for recognizing our impacts when any of us are developing policies, like health sector is developing policies that impact the environment, so we should have environment in all policies too, or whatever. But I think the siloing is still continuing a bit too much yet, and it's important that we start making sure that we are integrating as much as possible, and before we sign off on things, that we actually make sure that we've thought about the consequences of our actions. And I think one of the big issues that is sort of a bit hard to, I suppose, understand is why the health sector is such a huge sector of the society. That's like in Ireland, we've got a huge workforce and infrastructure. Isn't really expected to. It's not identified as a big sector to be dealt with under carbon emissions. I think it's not really seen as an area that can really contribute a lot to the carbon emissions, and that's the problem then, because if you don't get a mandate for it from under law to do that, the health sector's got so many problems itself. It's always going to be dealing with the demands of society, and often as a reactive service. It really needs to have a formal mandate, I think, to become sustainable and to become, to mitigate and also to adapt as well. And, the World Health Organization in Europe has recommended that we have sustainable health systems, and gives us 10 avenues to follow, but I don't see them being implemented really. I never hear of it within the health sector. So I think that's a bit of a gap, in a way, that the health sector isn't identified as a place, as a really valuable place for reducing emissions. And of course, within the health sector itself, it also produces some of the greenhouse gases that are unusual, anesthetic gases, and say the propellants for inhalers as well. They have an impact. So it's important. Maybe you can't do much about it, but maybe we can, and it's important that they are on the table. And I think it's important that when we're implementing this bill, if we can't fix the law about it, we need to make sure that it's in and the implementation that it's included.
No, thank you, Ina, for that. Yeah, no, I suppose it links back to what I was saying at the very beginning about the NHS having their carbon neutral targets by the early 2040s, and asking the question, does the HSE have similar targets? Has the HSE actually measured its carbon footprint, and has it actually identified what actions it's going to do in order to meet the principle of do no harm, which is what we all in public health at the very least need to be following, is at least do no harm.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any formal measurement of the emissions. I understand that we have a relatively small sustainability office in the Health Service Executive. It's in States function particularly, and I know that they're actively themselves trying to I suppose they recognise all the requirements, but they're not. I don't think they've got a formal mandate for really making huge change. I mean, this is a huge organisation. Everything we do is potentially positive, negative, or neutral, and in a way, none of that has been mapped to the best of my knowledge. It doesn't have much reach into the areas where we're working, and I mean, I've become very aware of it. I'm looking for it, and I don't really see it where I'm working, and I don't see it anywhere else either. So I think what it is it's not. But of course, the health service again needs to have mandate and budget to actually prioritize it, or it won't do it otherwise. It'll be while climate risks are obviously have huge health impacts, they're not seen as being health services priority to solve it all, because it's way outside their scope in a way. So it can only be as an integrated scope in some ways, I think.
Thank you, Ina, for that. Just I want to highlight one thing just for overseas speaker attendees today. When we say the Oireachtas, or the Oireachtas, it's an Irish word for the combined houses of the Irish Parliament, which is the Dáil and the Seanad. So I just wanted to clarify that for our overseas speakers. And I suppose that, again, some of you may not be aware, but the HSE has had a ransomware attack in the last couple of months, which for me has been of a benefit, because I've had very little that I've been able to do within my own particular job, and I've had the opportunity to look at some of the kind of the corporate plans and the operational plans within the HSE. And personally, I have to say, I am disappointed, because I don't see any clear commitment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or even any clear addressing of climate change within corporate plans. And this is an organisation that accounts for over 10% of the gross national income. I think the budget for the HSE is about €20 billion. or certainly was before COVID-19, and a staff number of 140,000 staff members. So I just wanted to make those points on top of what you've been saying, Aina. And the last question I just want to put to you, because I know we have quite a number of questions coming in on the chat box, is just in terms of COVID-19, what lessons have we learned in relation to COVID-19 that relate to climate change, and how can we deliver co-benefits?
Okay, well, as a specialist in public health medicine, I would always been interested in prevention of pandemics in the first place. Primary prevention is really stopping the virus from emerging, new viruses from emerging through, the places where they're likely to be at risk, at the interface between humans and, where emerging viruses from, zoonotic virus might occur. And then, of course, the secondary prevention is more to do with the pandemic, how it's stopping its spread. We do know how to do those things. I don't think we failed in 2019 to stop the emergence of a new virus and to contain it as soon as possible. And we can see the consequences for so many people in relation to that. And we knew about that. The science is there. We we can't actually prevent everything, but you can really step in quickly and try and control it. And I suppose that's what I'd be concerned about with climate action is we learn from our lessons of failure to prevent, number one, and failure to prepare. And if we don't learn from the lessons of COVID-19 and the misery it's caused so many people, I'd be a bit concerned that climate risks are a little bit less visible and they're less, tangible for a lot of people. So I think it's very important that we show that, I think anyway, that we should show that these are preventable issues and we need to prevent them into the future. And, failure to prevent is very unbearable in lots of ways. And the other thing, of course, is prevention is very unattractive because it costs money and the results aren't so visible. Because well, we're going to have to, I think, show that is spending money on cost-effective prevention is really worthwhile. And I think another thing, just in relation to that, then it's I suppose some things that came up even in COVID-19, like ventilation issues and so on. Our building stock. There are problems about not, and maybe I didn't mention before. We have issues about when you don't have health in planning in the first place, you're building buildings that aren't suitable in some ways for the risks that are coming, maybe COVID risks, but also, or in pandemic risks, but also climate risks as well, like overheating. In Ireland, we're building stock to keep the buildings warm, but not to keep them cool when there's hypothermia risk, during heat waves. We have, and I think what Tim was talking about agriculture, very important in relation to meat and so on, but also water quality in Ireland. We just don't acknowledge the fact that our main water quality issues in Ireland are probably zoonotic risks into water as well. So I think it's just all of these interlinked things. And I think crossing over the issues we already have, that, and learning from them, including COVID, and recognizing that tragedy is likely to occur if we don't anticipate it, prevent it, and prepare, prevent what we can and prepare for what we can to prevent.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aina, indeed. I love your phrase about health in all policies, and I like your focus on prevention. Prevention is sexy. Well, it is sexy, all right. It may not. We all know, I think, the economic benefits of prevention. You invest $1 in sanitation, for example, you get a $5 to $8 return on your investment. So I think maybe we need to be better at making the case for investing in prevention, because it delivers economically as well as health benefits. I'm going to stop you there, Aina. Unfortunately, we have about 16 minutes in total left to finish, and I know there's quite a number of questions coming in on the chat box. I might put one to you, the first one that came through to you, Anne. It's from Peter Owiti, who said that the EU is opening new oil wells in Africa, like in Kenya. This will only enhance carbon production. Is this really adherence to the Paris Agreement? I don't know if you got to see that question in the chat box. Can I put that to you first?
Thank you. And I think this really shows the importance of walking the talk. I mentioned that, with the EU Green Deal, we have this framework, and that's also what we have seen, that, the EU, the EU Commission has all the right language in place. They have the analysis in place, but then, the kind of conclusions they draw from it are not yet adequate. And so I think this for me would be part of that. Of course, then also checking, what is the EU's role in the world, or what is the role of the developed world, also in setting a leadership example, and going ahead with the transformation that we need to see, and stopping activities that are climate and health harming in other countries.
Okay. Thank you indeed, Anne. Another 2 questions in there from Catherine Conlon. I'm going to skip to the second one if you don't mind, Catherine, because I'm quite interested in the whole issue of behaviour change myself. And Catherine asked the questions: do we need to use behaviour change techniques using the BCOM model, opportunity, capability and motivation, as used with changing behaviour around COVID-19, more so in influencing behaviour change around climate change and the environment? I don't know if you're talking about using behaviour change techniques in relation to influencing policymakers, Catherine, or us as members of the general public, but I wonder if maybe Tim or Ina might like to address that particular question. And linked maybe to that is one that Catherine had asked at the beginning, was a recent draft UN report predicting crushing climate impacts sooner than feared. How quickly do we need to change our behaviours, I suppose? Who wants to talk? Ina?
Well, okay, I'll say something. I think behaviour change is very important, but it's also used sometimes as an alternative to actually setting good policies. I think from a public health perspective, some of the most important impacts come through legislation, and that's where a huge benefit is mainly. That's not, and I think that legislation is often what you have to think of when you're expecting the public and loads of people to do something. It's sometimes easier just to do it through legislation. And, of course, as long as it's clear what the benefit is to people, and I think as long as there is engagement around that, it just often makes things, it cuts out often the waste of time that's used in, I suppose, trying to, negotiate around things. Now, that's obviously, you can only really put in legislation when there's a very clear, I suppose, very clear actions that can be carried out. But I know that from return on investment, legislation is often by far the strongest. And I know there's a whole area called legal epidemiology that's being developed really, and that is looking at the benefit of legislation for public health. And they look at the interventional legislation like the tobacco and alcohol legislation, infrastructure legislation like the sort of stuff that we do in public health, say for investigation and control of infectious diseases, which of course we've had to use all year for COVID-19, or which we use all the time, but it was extremely important in 2020 for COVID-19. And then incidental legislation, and how we incentivize people, or we create barriers through, our legislation on tax and so on. So I think an awful lot of that is, our behaviour is often, it's making the easy decision. I'm not a behavioural expert, so I can't really go into it more detail than that, but I would say that I know that from a health promotion perspective, it's often making the healthy choice the easy choice, and incentivising it is often the way, or a good education, and also putting barriers to unhealthy options. And I think we need to clarify what, when there are unhealthy options there, what can we do to try and make them less attractive, make them less, stop incentivizing them. Often we're incentivizing the wrong choices. So I think that's where the legislation is. I mean, I'm using the word legislation, and I think it's probably other policies as well, having aligned policies, having aligned strategies and so on as well. But legislation is a very powerful tool, if not completely everything. It's really important all the same. And if you don't have legislation, it's sort of saying it's not that important, I think, and especially throwing it back onto people saying it's your job to fix that, I think that's inadequate.
Thank you very much.
But I'm not, but I do think behavior is important too. So yeah, but I'm not an expert on that.
I know there's other questions coming in for you there, specifically, Ina, but I want to turn my attention back to maybe to Dermot and Tim, because I know a lot of what Tim was talking about earlier on was about having immediate actions that can deliver benefit. But also maybe for you, Dermot, in terms of the policymakers and behaviour change, you said that there may be climate legislation and we have set targets and we set legally binding targets, but we don't necessarily adhere to those targets. What do you think needs to happen in order to influence the behaviour of our policymakers to deliver on the legally binding targets that we set?
Well, so policymakers are respond to incentives, and their incentives, elected politicians, their incentives come at the ballot box. So they will. That's where the ultimate accountability comes. So the courts offer one pathway to accountability in terms of meeting targets, but another pathway is by voting for parties that support strong climate action and voting out of office parties and politicians that don't. So I'd say that on behaviour change on the part of politicians. And for people interested in the whole topic of behaviour change, I might just mention the Environmental Protection Agency ran a 2-day conference yesterday and the day before. It was their annual climate change conference. And yesterday's session in the afternoon was focused on putting people at the centre of climate action, was the title of yesterday afternoon. I chaired the final session, and I would recommend, all the recordings are up online. I'd recommend anyone interested in the topic of behaviour change. Pete Lunn from the ESRI, who's become a household name, was one of the speakers and was very, very persuasive, actually, and quite critical of the climate policy community in the efforts that have been made to date around behaviour change. But one final word on that: it's not the individual or the system; it's both. And a lot of what came through in yesterday's EPA conference was around policies and legislation, the kinds of things Ina was talking about, being the context within which individual choices are made. So, and Pete Lunn actually said that, and this has been documented, that argument that people need to change their behaviour is the line that has been promoted by fossil fuel companies and other vested interests that wanted to avoid regulation and legislation themselves.
Thank you very much, Dermot. Look, I'd love us to continue this discussion for a lot longer, and I know there's a lot more activity in the chat box, and I'm really sorry to people that we can't address all your questions, because I wanted to kind of turn to closing now and ask each of the 4 speakers to deliver a kind of a parting thought on this particular topic before I hand back to Hala for closing. Who will I ask first? Maybe I can ask Anne, if you don't mind, first to give us your parting thought following our discussion this afternoon.
Thank you. Okay, I'll try to be quick on what was really very, very inspiring and encouraging conversation for me. And 2 things I wanted to state. Number one, I think there is a need for all of us in the health sector to make much stronger and repeat the message on the health co-benefits, because this is still not on policymakers' minds and also not so much on the public minds. And I think this is part of what hinders more ambitious action for climate. So making that clear, because otherwise we're going to get into all this discussion about it's costing too much or it's harming certain groups in the population, and we have to be clear that actually we'll see huge benefits, and climate action is also a way to overcoming health inequalities. And the second thought connected to that, when we talk about behavior change, I wanted to also stress that it's about, we also need to scrutinize what kind of incentives we give to people, because certainly a lot of people are ready. I think there's so much concern in Ireland, across Europe, about climate change, and people are ready to change. But then, we really need to stop any incentives in continued fossil fuel use. For example, in many countries, diesel fuel is still subsidized. And of course, that then, impacts the behavior and the choices that people make. And if they have no other choices, for example, for cheaper fuel. And these kind of things we need to look at as the health community, but also we need to ask our policymakers to really be true what they're saying when they talk about tackling climate change and protecting our health. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. Ina, can I turn to you, and if you can be as brief as you can, maybe a minute.
Well, I think it is important that health is on the agenda, is central to, and both central to climate action. And sorry, there are little things coming in front of me here. And I just think that the health sector is a very important sector, both for reducing emissions and also for bringing the case, the important case for the improvement of health and well-being is the biggest probably case for climate action. And so I suppose I think we can contribute and keep contributing in this regard. It's just interesting. There are some very good chats going on there, and it would be lovely to, I suppose we need to widen out the number of people who are involved in this. I know that I don't feel there are too many people from the health sector involved in climate change action. There are people in the Irish Doctors of the Environment and probably another few groups like that, but actually it isn't mainstream within the health sector. And I hope that would be important, that we're actually all fighting for better change, because at the moment I think we're a relatively small group still. Thank
you, Ina. I'm going to make a personal apology to a colleague of mine, Dominic Foley, that I couldn't address your question, Dominic. Sorry about that. Diarmuid, can you give us your parting thoughts, please?
Sure. Yeah. Just a couple of points, and thanks again for the invitation to participate. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a huge amount from the other panelists. So I think what we see in the climate bill is a reflection of what Ina was just talking about, which is that we haven't yet made those connections. So the community of people within health circles focusing on environment, as Ina said, is small. The fault lies just as much on the side of those of us working in the climate and environment space, that we are not making that connection. And that's reflected in the climate bill. But I'll come back to what I said in my opening remarks, which is that the bill is the framework, and there will be opportunities for all of these connections to be made in the long-term strategy, in the climate action plans, which are to be revised every year. And it's important to keep hammering home that message. So I would encourage you to keep going with that. Just a couple of other points. Sean O'Leary mentioned a question about the adaptation. And I think that's an important point. It's important that we don't focus only on mitigation. Adaptation is important to mention, particularly with health. And then very finally, just to plug a conference taking place on the 14th of July, Coalition 2030, the coalition of which the Irish Global Health Network is a member, is running a conference on a just recovery from COVID-19, how the Sustainable Development Goals can guide Ireland's recovery. And the link for that has just been put in the chat.
That's brilliant, Diarmuid. Thank you very much indeed for mentioning Coalition 2030 as well. Tim, can I finally turn to you, please, with your parting comments, please?
Thanks, Niall. Well, at the risk of repeating what's been said before, two things, I suppose. One is that the bill is not the end, it's the beginning, and there is an opportunity for us to actually insert health into the debate, and the Climate and Health Alliance and the Heart Foundation would be very happy to be part of that. And then just the second point, just to endorse what Anne and Ina just said about behaviour change. You know, we're a great country at putting personal responsibility on people for all our ills, but we've a lot to learn from public health in terms of the solutions. You know, there's a very good example in the last couple of years where we put a tax on sugar-sweetened drinks, and the drinks were immediately reformulated by companies who had been saying for years that they couldn't do that. And the amount of sugar that children are taking in as a result of that has actually been reduced. And that was down to a tax and a pricing mechanism. So if you want to drive behaviour change, look to public policy. Don't load the burden on people. People will change their behaviour, but give them the incentive.
Yeah, well, I like that, Tim. There's always a bit of carrot and stick when it comes to behaviour change, and it's finding the right mix on that. Look, I'm going to wrap up there because we've got 1 minute left, and I want to hand over to Hala to close. But I want to thank each of the speakers, and I want to thank all of the participants. I know you put in lots of questions there, and unfortunately we couldn't deal with them all. I think we've had a very lively and healthy discussion. And I suppose one of the key messages is that we have to stay connected on this issue. This cannot drop off the policy table, it cannot drop off the action table, and health is so interconnected. We all need to stay connected on this. Again, thank you very much, and over to you, Hala, to close, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niall, and thanks to our speakers for this very important and amazing discussion. A lot of food for thought. Also, thanks to all the attendees for joining the event today and also for interacting. We hope to see you again in our upcoming webinar of Global Health Matters webinar series, which will be on September the 24th. If you liked our event or you have any suggestions, please take a few minutes to fill in our evaluation form, which is now sent by our team to the chat box. The recording of today's event will be added to the Irish Global Health Network YouTube channel and newsletter, and also to our website, www.globalhealth.ie. Thanks again, everyone, and have a lovely day. Bye.